We're all good.
Well, this was zero notice.
No worries.
One of our faculty couldn't make it, and he asked me to report last Friday. Recorded.
Oh, so we're getting a visual recording. That's good.
I have never introduced as many people as I've introduced Bill. This is what, 10th introduction, something like that? He's been coming here for more than 10 years, and it's always a delight to have him, because he comes in not as a lecturer as much as an agent provocateur. He rolls into our group, and we try to give him demos, and we get about 30 seconds, and then he launches into the next idea that we should have been working on instead of what we were working on. And so the usual 5-minute demos take several hours, and they're action-packed and full of great ideas about which we actually get time and resources to implement. But boy, is it stimulating. So, pardon?
But it's the right hand.
Oh, well, I think so. I'll let you be the judge of that. The other thing I can say about Bill is I don't get to introduce many people as a true Renaissance man, but he is. He started life out as a professional musician, as an undergraduate degree in music, in fact, and worked at a music institute, learning and teaching in the Netherlands, my home country. And then in the mid-70s, he decided to work on inventing digital instruments, and of course brought the power of thinking like a musician who used both hands, right? Most of the time. So he is, as far as I'm concerned, the real inventor of bimanual interaction, which we still don't have as a de facto way of interacting with computers today anymore as a kid. Working on digital instruments led him to a master's degree in computer science and the field of human-computer interaction, in which he is certainly a guru, if not the guru, at this point. He has had both experience teaching in academia, works primarily at the University of Toronto, but has also had appointments in other places, and he's worked in such distinguished research labs as Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. He was the chief scientist for Alias Wavefront, which is part of Autodesk. How many of you use Maya? Okay, a few of you. Much of the user interface thinking came from Bill and his band of spectacular students. Really, we came after all. We're videotaping.
With somebody else.
And let's see. Most recently, he's a very distinguished research scientist at Microsoft Research. You may know him from the book that he's written, Structured User Interfaces, which is the confluence of his design experience and design creativity and ideas about how one should design user interfaces. And finally, to complete the portrait of a Renaissance man, he's a totally crazy, obsessed outdoorsman. And there isn't an outdoor sport, including such risky stuff as ice climbing, that he doesn't do. I've been biking with him, and it's a blues proposition. He helped the Trek people design some of their racing bikes for the Tour de France. Every outdoor sport you can imagine, scuba diving, kayaking, climbing, touring, and he's a really superb equestrian as well. Anyhow, without further ado, I've already rattled on too much.
So it's gonna be hard.
Pleasure to have you back, in case that wasn't obvious.
It feels like home. I feel like an adjunct where my term is just spread out over 10 years.
That's a good way to think of it.
And so on. But it's funny, like, wow, you think some of the guys have been here the whole time. It's scary.
That's a feature, not a
Well,
bug.
So, the challenge is coming back, so often is that, I can't remember what I said in the last 10 years, and so I just hope that there's not that many people, if I ever repeat myself, was thinking I should have kept a record of that, and I can just pull out a lecture from 5 years ago or 10 years ago and do it again. But I think we started doing this around 1995. I think at least 3 years. But anyhow, I hope this isn't, I don't think we haven't talked about this specific topic before. And that, but there's this whole thing around NUI that is in space. By the way, interrupt, because I figured you have got to take as well as you give. And so for those of you who I interrupted every 5 seconds, feel free to do the same. And I'm happy to change topics, and don't wait to ask questions, because if you do it during the talk, you will get an answer, it will be finished. If you leave it to the end, we'll have to keep on going. So before everybody starts to. But let's just start right off the bat. This notion of NUI is a bizarre thing, because on lots of different levels. So the first thing is, what's the abbreviation and acronym stand for? And most people, including Microsoft, call it Natural User Interface. I don't. The first thing, just to make it a less technocentric approach, I call it natural user interaction. The reason is because the interaction makes it more of a verb and rather than a noun, and therefore it brings it into the activity, not to the technology. So if I'm going to use the term, that's what we're using. And is it bad? Well, I think it's useful because it does draw attention to the fact that it has a parallel to the graphical user interface, which was an interface. But to something that's sufficiently different to warrant a different label. And even if not the manifestation and the mindset of what it's about. But the problem here is this notion of natural. And this drives me, because people have such inane notions about what's natural. You know, if it's got touch, oh, it's natural. If it uses quote-unquote natural language, oh, it's natural. It's natural. And all I can tell you is that there's a lot of places where I could speak, touch, or wave and be arrested. Okay? And that's natural. Right? And so the first thing I could just sort of save us all a lot of time, and instead of saying natural user interaction, call it appropriate interaction. And that's in some ways a more useful term, but it's actually captures the same meaning, but in a way that maybe makes it easier to have things be operational. So let's see what I mean by that. This is my now 37-year-old son when he was a baby. And he was way cuter than I gotta tell you. And so, if it's, a lot of people say, well, natural user interaction is easy. It's stuff that's innate. It's just stuff we're born with. All right? Let me take you up on that. Just became a grandfather in May for the first time. And that's a whole other story. But I'm intimately acquainted with babies. And what I can tell you, here's what's natural. Burping, farting, pooping, peeing, screaming, after 90 days giggling, and sort of kicking. That's it. Now, if you want to make a barking, farting, pooping, peeing user interface, that's natural. And that's based on the natural motor capability. They can't track your eye tracking, forget it. They can't focus. Can't speak, so that's not natural. Not born with that. Not born with any of the things that we use to things. But if you want to talk to me about you're born with it, it's natural, it's innate, then take Adam or your favorite baby, take their skills that they have control of, and build an interface for that, and then you solve the problem. Or you shut down whoever's taking that kind of just naive view of what the term means. And just because everybody's doing it doesn't make it natural. There's all kinds of collections of aberrant behavior. But anyhow, this is still Adam. That you realize that there's protective mechanisms for some of his natural instincts. Now, for sure, the human is the ultimate multimodal, multimedia, natural interactive I/O technology going. It's organic, it's got all this sort of stuff. But that's not very helpful. But there is one thing which is also innate. And this is where the whole notion, for me, of natural interaction stems from. What is innate is our innate capacity to acquire skill, to learn. It doesn't mean you're born with the knowledge, but you're born with the potential to acquire knowledge. You're born with a certain capacity to actually do so whether you like it or not. Kids learn no matter what. It just depends. You can help shape what they learn. You can maybe help them shape a little bit to get better at how they learn, but they will learn. But if that's the case, and we all know, as soon as we can do that little piece of logic, we also realize that we all learn different things. It's hugely culturally dependent. Right? Okay, Andy speaks Dutch fluently. I speak Dutch enough to get in trouble, but not fluently. Dutch is his natural language. Deutsch is his natural language. Anybody else got another language? Anybody? You speak Chinese? Mandarin or Cantonese? Okay. Spanish. Okay, Spanish. Okay, those are your natural languages. Although you've been here probably since before puberty. Yes. Because you don't have an accent. After puberty, you have an accent. The reason they have such a long period between birth and puberty is to acquire language. So two things. It's interesting and some other needs. But that's another story. The point is this. So-called natural language systems, you're speaking Chinese, that's not natural here. I want to understand the word. How's that help? Okay. It's a one-way system. It's not a bi-directional. So it's natural to speak, given where you grew up, Mandarin. It would be more surprising if you spoke Mandarin. And it's surprising that I speak Dutch, which is why I embarrass Dutch people when they're speaking Dutch and saying things they shouldn't say in public because they assume nobody speaks it. And then I just say, don't speak, so I'm leaving the restaurant. Then they turn red. That's another story. But the point I'm saying is this, the capacity to learn is the main thing. And we all learn different things. And what's natural for some is not natural for others. There's individual differences, and therefore no single interface generally is natural. Natural is completely a relative term, depending on context of history as well as context of action. So this is the key word here, skill. Therefore, our real challenge here, if we want to understand the nature of design, of natural or appropriate design, or natural or appropriate interaction, we have to understand a little bit more about the nature of skill. And so, it's all about skilled task performance. And there's a couple things here. I can just tell you that no matter how much you eat Chinese food, if you're not a native eater, if you weren't born in that culture, you're not as good as you think you are. Unless you can really quickly pick up a piece of rice reliably, right? You watch people eat, okay. If you want to, and you have to understand, there's a guy named Rasmussen who studied this stuff. And there's three levels of skill. And I want skilled performance. The best interaction interfaces are the ones that make use of the skills to acquire for life and live in an everyday world. I would argue that the purpose of HCI is, if you were going to, I could write it as a formula even, is to accelerate the rate with which a novice begins to perform like an expert. So a different way, the purpose of HCI design and UX design is to accelerate the rate at which one goes from unskilled to skilled performance. And when I say that, I mean that at the operational level, not at the semantic level. Meaning, if you're doing music, I'm not trying to make you an expert musician. I'm trying to make you an expert at the computer so you can spend all of your cognitive, motor sensory, and other resources on music problems, not on how to operate the damn computer. If you're doing engineering or art, it's not interface design, it's out-of-interface design. Get it out of their way and get on with the job. Let me focus all resources. If you don't need all your resources to perform the task you're using the computer for, why are you bothering to use a computer? Use a pencil. And this is I say this in a sense because, okay, so skilled performance is the target. And I want to get there from being a novice, unskilled. It means I got a starting place, I got an ending place. But how do I know if I've made it or not? So, assuming I know what skilled is, what is the opposite of skilled? And please don't say unskilled because that just is non-productive. From a behavioral perspective, what's the opposite of skilled?
Clumsy?
Clumsy.
Novice.
Yeah, pardon?
Novice.
Novice, that's just another from a beginner. In the same, that's not, okay.
Flexible.
So it's interesting. Anyone else? It's a really good question. And by the way, I did pick up the answer. Stu Card and Tom Moran and Alan Newell wrote a really good book. It's one of the classics of cognitive aspects of HCI. And this is one of the biggest takeaways from reading that book. Okay, I'll tell you, because for me, this was, you read something and somebody's just way smarter than you, and it's just so enlightening, and you sit there and it changes your whole perspective forever after. This was one of those moments. The opposite of skilled performance from behavioral thinking is problem-solving performance. It's problem-solving behavior versus skilled. Problem-solving consumes cognitive resources or motor sensory resources. And skilled performance is automatic. One is attentive, and in psychology books, it's attentive behavior, which consumes resources, versus automatic behavior, which is like firing up a subroutine. The only task you need to do is fire which subroutine to do. It executes on a coprocessor that doesn't use up any of the CPU cycles of your brain. It's somewhere in the cloud, okay? Then we need to say, okay, I've got problem solving, attentive behavior to automatic. What's the process of skill acquisition? If that's skill, what's the essence of doing that? And we actually know that. It's called aggregation, and it's basically the clustering, it's chunking, and so on. But we'll talk about that. But the first thing we need to know is these two, starting here, get from here to there. Now, we know a couple things. We know that acquiring skill is really, really hard. It's something called the power law of practice. So, if talking about the 80-20 rule, stuff like that, you can get halfway to becoming an Olympic athlete. Everyone in this room, if you worked at it, within your age group, could get to be maybe 50% of an Olympic athlete. Half of those could get halfway to 3/4. Keep going. But forget the 80-20 rule. 90% of Olympic athletes' time is spent on the last 10%. That's the hard part. That's the difference between you don't even make the team. And I mean, these things are measured in nanoseconds or sometimes fractions of a second. And so what I'm saying is that there's a study, this learning curve, of people who started when they were 10 years old, rolling cigars in Cuba. Onto a study, rolling cigars, and that's all they've done. And now we're here, they're 70 years old. They're still rolling cigars. Same factory, stuff like that. Guess what? They're still improving. It doesn't stop. And that's one of the classic studies. It's really interesting. So you sit there and say, oh, okay, skill acquisition is really expensive. So the first thing was, since we understand that we need skill performance, and we're coming from problem solving, essentially, how do I accelerate the acquisition of skill? Well, instead of having you learn, which is really expensive, that's the last resource. That's the last resort. Far better is skill transfer. Take a skill that you already have and transfer it to the new context, because you already have that skill, whether it's a motor sensory skill or a cognitive skill or a social skill. Now that becomes really interesting. If we do that, but now I start saying, and when I've talked this way, people, like Nick Agripanti would be one of them, say, well, you're just reinforcing the old way of doing things. So you're now going to just use computers and stuff like that to do these old new tools, use the old to do the old things and the same old models. You're not changing things. Well, that shows that that those such people have a limited imagination. I'd argue that the difference between creativity and imagination is how far removed the thing you're transferring the skill from is, from the thing you're applying it to. And you can do great innovation if you take something that is apparently really remote to something that where it really applies, fits, and skill transfers. Yeah, question?
So for years, I've been trying to do curriculum design, trying to use this principle
Yeah.
where we try to do skill transfer rather than learning. And the difficulty, I think, is when you assume that people have a skill that they don't.
Because they're not natural. They're only natural for them because of the environment, the nature of the environment within which they grew up.
Right, but that seems to be a problem that all UI design is going to have, is you make this assumption about what skills they have, and
It depends on the level of skill and sense skill. So, absolutely key point, you gotta be really attentive. That's why I have the graphics, all this other stuff, you gotta do your research. But let's say, I'd say that scrolling on my computer and driving my car is a perfect example of skill transfer. Driving a car, among other things, I have strong stimulus response compatibility with the notion that speed varies with pressure. It's called the throttle, both in positive directions with the throttle, and with negative in terms of the brake. And now this sort of says instantly, what is wrong with us? How sloppy and lazy. The graphical user interface has been around since the 70s. It's been commercially available to everybody since '84. And we still don't have a mouse with a force-sensitive resistor under the left mouse button. So when you point at the scroll arrow, the harder you push, the faster it scrolls, right? I mean, it's just like, yeah, duh. I can remember, what's his name who founded Wang? Wang.
Wang.
He
wasn't Grant's too, but-
That's right, he was always Dr. Wang, that's
So,
right.
not doctor, the doctor.
The doctor, yes, that's right. So go back there and say, well, I'm doctor. Yeah.
Doctor.
Anyhow, I was explaining this, and they said, oh, that can't work. You don't know how many pixels hardest the pixels, and that'll never, it's this crazy idea. Oh man, you guys are screwed. And they were. I've got pressure sensing in my stylus, and I've had it for years. It's skinny, it's simple, it costs nothing. I still don't have it. And that wheel, that's the RSI acceleration device. Anyhow, I'm just pointing out that there's a case where there's a lateral thing, and they're both dealing with speed, and the correspondence of pressure speed is pretty broadly known. If you ride a bicycle, you've got it from the brakes. The harder you pull, the more the speed change. Negative versus positive. So anyhow, skill transfer, really important. It's a resource, how we do it. Automatic. And one of the other things here is in skill performance, and this is, okay, nobody's asked me about the chopsticks. I'm supposed to keep you on the track here. So what's the chopsticks got to do with it? Between skilled and problem solving, there's this middle thing that Rasmussen found out. Remember him I mentioned earlier? Which was basically rule-based behavior, where you've got it, you're almost consolidated. You've written a program, but you haven't put it in a subroutine yet. The algorithm's written, you've got it, you just haven't quite done it. And people think, I'm going to give 2 examples to show you, because all of you have to have one of these, or close. And it's also tell you how to get people to buy you food and stuff like that. If you're not native-born chopstick eater, invite your friends out to a Chinese restaurant. Use chopsticks and wait till they have their food almost in their mouth and ask them a really hard question. And they will either stop eating or they'll try to keep eating because they're smart asses and they think they can eat with chopsticks, and they will drop their food all at once. Because to answer the hard question requires cognitive resources which are currently occupied by eating, so either they're going to answer the question or they're going to drop their food. They can't do the 2 things at the same time. When I was teaching people to ride and when I was learning how to ride horses, you would get people to ride their horse to the fence before they jump, and the rule was you had to spell your name backwards as you went over the fence. And the reason was you could test if they were skilled or problem solving, or in this rule-based behavior, because it's really hard to spell your name backwards. And that takes all your cognitive resources. So if you had it consolidated in motor memory and everything like that, you would be able to still jump, knock down the rail. I'll give you another example. All of us at some point tried to win a girl or boy by learning how to play guitar. You learned how to play, if you actually really practiced Blackbird, that was the sort of the classic thing. The cool thing about the Beatles Blackbird things, right? It's a hard song to play. So you play it and you finally got it down. You can play it perfectly. Fantastic. And if I was playing it, you could sing it. So you know all the words you've got to memorize, and you can play the guitar all the time, and then you say, fantastic, I'm ready to go. You go on stage, or you go in front of your girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever it is, and you completely screw up because you're not skilled, because you haven't memorized it. You're thinking the whole time to try and pull it out. It's not automatic yet. And until you're completely skilled in playing, or you're completely skilled in the lyrics, the two tasks will interfere, despite the fact you can do either one of them independently. Now, the reason this is important is that in almost all of the non-trivial things we do, especially with computers, are in fact compound tasks. It's not, it's not just I want to locate something, I want to scale it, or I want to navigate and select. But I'm navigating, I'm selecting, all these things are compound transactions. And so one of the things you can do is try and integrate those things together by using, the reason we had a two-handed input was so I could do the navigation with one hand and the selection with the other. I could do the scaling and the positioning simultaneously. And if you look at my early work especially, it was not so much about two-handed stuff, it was about compound tasks that you could articulate either in tight parallel sequence in a gestural sense or in parallel. Because if you can tie the gestural language together to reinforce the chunking of the atomic subtasks into a single gestalt, the body language would reinforce the association of the subcomponents so that you could learn them, what the relationship is. Yes?
You started off with the question of being natural.
Yes.
And now you're discussing the question of being skillful.
Yes.
And the question is, did you discuss the first because it was somehow related to
Yes.
the second? Or are the two entirely different?
The
or are they related?
Okay. The natural thing is the capacity to acquire skill. That's what makes things
You're
natural.
saying that's the primary
That's
natural topic? That's
because if
questionable.
the term is natural, the natural element of the human that we're exploiting is their ability to acquire skill. And if we want to make the interface, and many of these skills people have, so I can acquire the skill. And by the way, when I say skill, I really mean there's at least 4 levels of skill: motor, sensory, cognitive, social, let us say emotional, and maybe cultural. Could be. We get softer as we go up this thing. And we have to get all of those right. We can talk about that as we go along. But this is automatic versus attentive behavior, and let's just move along here. I'll give you an example. I had one of these when I was at university. I went to the scrapyard, and for $200, I bought 2 MGAs that didn't work. I took them back, I took them apart, I made one good one out of them. Mine was not shining like that. It was held together with duct tape. The rocker panels were eavesdrops, which I welded on. And you had to crank it in winter to keep it going. But I gotta tell you, if you're 19 years old as an undergraduate and you have an MGA, it's great.
You don't need to learn Blackbird.
You don't have to learn and I can fix cars better than I can play guitar. Exactly. Now, the thing about these cars is that they had a really interesting thing that was especially cool. They had a stick shift. And there's actually a reason to this rather than just talking about English sports cars. The stick shift was really, really neat, because most people didn't, if you had a shift, it was something like steering column, most people had automatic transmissions, and in Canada anyhow, you needed to take a different driver's test to be able to drive a standard. If you had an automatic license, you weren't allowed to drive a standard. Now, the inevitable thing happens, because I had to fix the car. I sold the parts, ended up for $110, I had a sports car with a spare motor. You'd be driving down the road with this girl beside me. I did this once. Said, wow, this is really, can I work the stick shift? I'm a teenager, I've got a girl beside me. She gets whatever she wants. So, of course. Because after all, I know that I'm doing less work now. Because she's going to work the stick shift. I don't have to work the pedals and keep steering.
Who's going to work the clutch?
No.
I'm going to work the clutch. I'm doing the clutch and the throttle and the steering. And she's going to work the stick shift. Well, guess what? I'm doing less work. I've decomposed the task. This should make things easier. But you all know what's going to happen, right? There's going to be this incredible grinding sound, and I'm going to be really lucky if the transmission's down there, and guess who's got to fix the transmission? And by the way, to fix the transmission thing, you got to pull the radiator out, the motor out, because there's no way to drop it down below because the idiots have decided to have a beam across the bottom. Trust me, I know that for a very good reason, okay? Which I just described to you. Now, this is really important because when I say skills are aggregations of tasks, once you've learned it, you can't decouple them, right? They really are a single, they are a gestalt. You can't think about them. But in most ways when we work with computers, you never have that chance because there's no way biomechanically to integrate them. So this becomes a really fascinating thing because you also realize all the troubles you had, how many people here ever learned to drive on a standard, where you did have to learn how to, and that hiccuping, right? And it's really not cool. And if you haven't done that, think about when you learned how to ski. And bend your knees, weight in the lower ski, top ski, up ski, heel ski forward, turn your shoulders, you also face down the heel, do all this sort of stuff, and now move down a 45-degree slope. Give me a break, right? You're going to kill yourself. And all of a sudden, somehow, you stop thinking about any of those subcomponents, you just ski. And the problem solving was, what route am I going to take to get the most air or the most fun? It's really, really interesting. The level of problems, you're always problem solving, but you pump it up and bump it up. As you get more and more skilled, the aggregations get bigger and bigger, so you go to higher and higher level problems. Can I jump that cliff, or can I go through these trees? How do I deal with the ice? Yeah. So let's look at this, the task of a gear change. You got 4 subtasks. You got to steer, you got to work the throttle, you got to work the clutch, you got to work the stick. And then from that, you got to pop the throttle, you got to depress and release the clutch. There's a sequence thing here, right? Coming down, time is going this way. I've got to steer the whole way, and the stick I've got to grab, I've got to change, and I've got to release and get my hands back on the wheel. So I've got to do all those things. And those things are all done in parallel through time this way. When I'm a beginner, I have to think about every one of these things independently, plan the strategy, and plot that out. It's exactly like in an old command things when you're typing in a Hollerith card, you have to remember the order of the signatures you're keying in, which meant the syntax was really a pain in the ass to learn. When you're an expert, I just say I'm going to change gear. And by the way, when you got good at it, which I did, except in first gear where there's no synchro mesh, I could change gears by listening to or looking at the tachometer gradually by ear without using the clutch. Bang. Every rally driver can do that. It's one of these things where all of a sudden you feel like you've graduated. It's like getting a PhD, where you can change gears on a manual transmission without using the clutch. Ask if you have any friends who are rally drivers, they will tell you that I'm not lying. And that you don't have to replace your transmission. You can't go from forward to reverse by pilot. There's our limitation. So all of this, that whole tree here collapses so that the weight of the decision to change gears has about the same load on the user as any one of these things put together at the beginning. The complexity goes down. There's a woman named Phyllis Reasoner who figured this all out. So for me, on all of my gestural stuff, on the movement and stuff like that, and this is the paper that Hinckley would say is the best paper I ever wrote, because he cites it all the time, but I think he might be right, was a chunking and phrasing paper. So one of the ways to do teaching for this type of thing in terms of motor transactions, once you have this theory, I said, well, if the body language reinforces the chunking, the structure of the chunks, and the elements of the chunks, that they belong together, the acquisition of the skill will be accelerated. And if you think about it, and you use a pop-up menu, you're doing something extremely complicated. If you've ever written the code to support a pop-up menu, it's really complicated. Because think about it, the minute you push down, you can do all kinds of things. You can select anything in the menu, you can go off, you can do secondary menus, and at any point, no matter what you do, the only thing you can do once you push the button is release it. Because sometimes you gotta go home or go to the toilet or go eat, right? You gotta let go of it. I'm in a non-stable state when I'm holding the mouse and holding down the button. But the interesting thing is, the entire transaction is bracketed by going into a state of tension with perhaps some motion, and then I release. And from the moment I initiate the action to the moment I release is the most important part, because of the elegant, beautiful, beautiful design of the interaction. It's not possible. It's not possible to make a mistake of syntax. No matter what you do, is legal. It may not be what you wanted. It may be a semantic error, but it's not possible to make a mistake of grammar like that. And that's completely different than if you're typing the same things in a command language, for example. And so that kind of observation grew for me, that notion of recognizing tension grew out of singing and playing a wind instrument. This notion of phrasing, and how phrasing ties together words. It tells us when we're interruptible by the pauses. You have to breathe. The intensity. And that there's two things that we have in motor action that let us achieve that type of phrasing. And one is motion. I start moving, and when I stop moving, I'm back to neutral. Or tension, muscular tension. And that's what I would call kinesthetic connectivity. That I'm in the middle of an utterance, and I phrase the interaction with the computer in terms of gestural stuff in a way that I chunk what I'm trying to articulate into meaningful segments, like sentences, complete utterances of a reasonable string, so that everything's bound together. Now, the reason the Macintosh had this noun-verb syntax is it says you're all a bunch of idiots. You could never deal with something that's any more complex than a noun-verb. You select a thing, you select a noun, and then you select a verb. That's why you have copy this or paste here. Now what that really says, if you studied language, is you are an idiot and you can only deal with the verb and one object, either a direct object or an indirect object. But the notion of dealing with the verb with an indirect object and a direct object, no, no, no. Stay away, you're too stupid. And yet, by kinesthetic connectivity, proofreader symbol, I circle the word, I do the gesture, I go to the destination, and I release. In that one continuous stroke and gesture, I specify the verb, the direct object, and the indirect object. Move, verb, that, the direct object, there. And it is impossible. You will never make a mistake of syntax. That is a complete, and it will always be a complete, and it will always be a correct utterance. You will never get it wrong. You might put it in the place you didn't intend. You might circle the wrong word. That's your problem. But the fluidity eliminates completely all that stuff. And by the way, that forced you to get that quote-unquote simplicity. This is the important part. The second lesson that comes out of this is about making things natural. Stu Card said to me once, it was brilliant, when I was talking about mouse buttons, he says, oh, and the thing is, they didn't make things simpler. Any simplicity you get at the beginning by having a one-button mouse, that's a 10-minute or 10-hour problem in the span of thousands of hours of usage of the computer, and you pay a price of inefficiency for the rest of the time. So if you're not, so spend a bit of time learning how to touch type, and then you reap the investment back a million times over. But if you keep typing with two fingers, and the mouse button doesn't allow you to come up, the single mouse button doesn't. Okay, even if you don't agree with that example, the point is this. Often when you think you're simplified, you're simply transferring the complexity to a different place. What you want to understand is, where's the balance about upfront prerequisites, getting a driver's license and then being able to drive, versus being able to walk up and use, but be inefficient forever. And those are two extremes, and we have to deal with those types of things. And a lot of the research about marking menus and so on was all about how do you put training wheels so you can start simple and go and have every step along the way accelerate your learning as you go along. But the key thing is the whole notion of all this collapsing so that we only have to attend to that level of detail and not this level happens by the design of the gesture. Learning how to work tools in parallel or sequentially. Sequentially, like in the copy or move this there, proofreader symbol is a sequential chunking. Driving the car is a parallel chunking. It doesn't matter, they both work. It just depends what's appropriate. So, all this stuff, right? It's easy once you know how. It's obvious once you know how. It's transparent once you know how. It's natural once you know how. But guess what? You didn't always know how. And forget that. It's natural to just, think it's stuff that you just take for granted now. Think how hard it was when you learned how to tie a shoelace. It's natural now, because you have the skill. And none of these things they weren't always easy. You didn't always know how, but they're not all, none of them are inherently natural. It's only natural that you have the capacity to make them easy to know how. But once you've paid the price, anybody who designs a system that doesn't take best efforts to take advantage of these highly expensive things that you purchased out of your time and effort is disrespectful. So I'd say natural interaction design is appropriate design which is respectful of the time that the customer or user has invested in acquiring those hard-won skills. And, the telephone is a really good example. You sort of think, well, that's pretty easy. We know how to use that. Let's go back. I've got that. Okay, there's a picture of a woman with a big thing. I have no idea what it's fading out.
You're saying PowerPoint isn't natural?
When the phone first came out, before the dial, we had Siri. We had perfect, intelligent systems that had perfect natural language, speech, response, and displays. You just pick up a Siri, you tap the thing, and you can speak anything. And it wasn't called Siri, I think it was called Mabel. Mabel, I want to call Andy. Just will you connect me to him? Siri would say, Andy's not home, he's at the barber shop because he just made a call there to Sam, but I'll hook you up to the barber shop. And then, well, magically, these speech recognition systems of those days were absolutely perfect. And then we replaced them with some stupid dial, and you have to remember all these numbers. And now we're just trying to get back to where we were. That's the irony of it, right? But the point was, is when we went to dials, people went around, and there was a picture there that just faded by of a woman with a great big dial this big. And people like that went all over the country to schools and offices, and they were hooked up to the phone, and so they could demonstrate how to dial a phone. And it's unimaginable, right? There's lots of you look. I'm not joking. I love history. I collect this kind of goofy stuff, but I would love to find one of those phones. But yeah, we can. The problem is, this is Kim's game. How many things can you remember? And the number of digits. It turns out that if I show you this and then take it away, you can remember about 7 things. It's George Miller's 7 ± 2. The reason phone numbers are there is because it matches our natural capacity. We have certain inborn abilities for memory and motor action, and that's all this is meant to talk about. But this is there's a little bit of psychology here that when you're asking people to remember things, 7 ± 2. If you don't know this essay, it's absolutely essential and obligatory reading for anybody working in this field, because it's just one of the most interesting things about the notion. But it also talks about cognitive skill. Here's what George Miller said. I'll give it to you really simply because he came out of this period of information theory. Is that if you give someone a memory test, how many things can you remember? In short-term memory, you can acquire 7 ± 2, somewhere between 5 and 9 things you'll be able to remember. There's slight individual differences, but I'm sorry, that's it. I don't care who you are, what culture you're from, that's hardwired.
Exceptions for photographic memory.
All right. Mr. Smarty Pants here is about to find out whether he's right or not. So the first thing people say, anybody here play chess? There are people who look at a chessboard and they can memorize all the pieces and they prove I'm wrong because there's more than 7 pieces on the chessboard. Guess what? Simon and Newell did a study. They got grandmasters of chess who could do that. And then they just put the pieces in arbitrary places on the chessboard, and they behaved just as poorly as you or me. Okay, this is really important. I said you could remember 7 numbers. So, is anybody here a social scientist as opposed to a computer scientist? All right. Doesn't matter which numbers I give you, 1s or 0s or 10s, so on. You're going to remember a certain number of numbers. But there's people here who are really good at octal. And if I gave you 7 binary numbers, 1s and 0s, you could remember a sequence of about more or less 7. But if somebody here knows octal, I'll give you a sequence of a whole long sequence, and they can appear to be able to remember way more binary numbers, but if they just basically take them, and as soon as they get the right number, make an octal number, and then remember 7 digits, so they encode on the fly. They remember 7 octal digits, now you, okay? So now all of a sudden, they'll make you look like you don't have no memory. No, they just know, they took a computer science course. And they did with numbers what the chess players did with the chessboard. So they have a process, and that's a skill too, where they can see things and encode them. And so you can remember 7 chunks, not 7 numbers. And you can load semantically each of those chunks with as much information as you have learned to encode. It's the quantity not of element, objects, not the quantity of information loaded into those envelopes that you can remember, which is really fascinating. And so again, when we understand this kind of stuff, we can start to think about, when I think about any interface, and this comes down probably to the thing we were looking at today, is that remember I said there's this thing, if anybody can walk up and use it, and you have 3 to 5 minutes, and they have to get 80% of their functionality with a 90% retention a week later, blah, blah, blah. Here's another way to say it. Can you give me 7 things, and if I know these 7 things, you can do everything. Everything is discoverable with 7 instructions. It's an issue with me with Windows 8. There's more than 7 things. I don't mind having to learn stuff. But if you want me to make it so I can walk up and start being really productive, if there's more than 7, so I always, when I'm starting a project, say, what are the 7 rules on which the entire thing is based on? And this comes to reading Miller. Yeah?
I don't quite buy that line of questioning, simply because the 7 is about short-term memory. And
yes, I understand that.
Acquiring the knowledge of expertise of Windows 8 could take a while.
I get that. As long as I don't expect to get 100%. I need to be able to get functional, so I'm bootstrapped.
Okay, so okay.
Just bootstrap.
Got it.
And then I want those other things to still be discoverable.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's a good point, right? It's not about learning everything. It's about, I just don't want to feel like an idiot and be trapped.
Right.
Okay. I need to be able
You
to
have to be able to
function.
get yourself out of holes with 7.
Yeah.
With that 7. That's the key thing.
That's right. And now there's one other thing about humans, and this is universal as well, that we have to pay attention to. And this helps a lot. So this is a friend, one of my past students, and this is her daughter. And they're doing the thing that many of us have done with our children, or were done to us when we were children, and that is on your birthday, you get your height measured, and this is the height of their family on the door in the pantry in the kitchen. So why do you do that? It's very simple. Look at your parents, your siblings, or your children, whatever your age is, or your dog. Let's be very clear. None of us, forget the hangovers, just rule those out. None of us look older in the morning when we wake up than we were when we went to bed at night. And yet, the accumulation of those invisible steps means that you might have grown 3 inches through the course of a year. Who's never noticed it? We cannot perceive gradual, continuous change. And that's why you do this, to find out, oh, my daughter just became a woman, or whatever. Now, that's a scary thing. Sometimes don't have daughters if you're a guy. Don't have daughters if you're a guy.
Too late.
No. We lived through it. And actually she gave us a grandson, so she's redeemed herself. And we really like the father. So it's all's good. Now, the point is this, is that there's a lot of stuff changing. And we nearly always get way, way past the point where they've gone through the transition before we recognize it. This is natural in all kinds of things. There's a hysteresis of perception. There's some interesting studies done at Stanford acoustically where they could interpolate between a trumpet and a clarinet in 7 steps. You know, beep, 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 whoa, wah, ah, like that. Fascinating thing is, tell me when you hear the clarinet starting with the trumpet. When you're 3/4 of the way through. Okay, let's go from the clarinet by exactly the same sequence towards the trumpet. Guess what? You don't hear the trumpet. You're 3/4 of the way through. And there's all kinds of things like that, that if you understand these, this is good in terms of just thinking of design too, that we don't notice that things are getting cheaper, or things are getting faster. We don't notice these things. But there's lots of subtle changes that we need to take explicit measures. Once we understand our limitations as to perceive, we need to take explicit actions to be able to take advantage of them. And this, since I'm talking about all this, there's deep science behind all this stuff. And this is why you just say, no, I'm an intuitive designer, I can design stuff. I can design by method. I can make predictions. I can have theory behind the decisions, as opposed to say, it just feels right, I'm just intuitive, I'm just a genius, I'm so clever. I dress in black, right? And that's why you study this. This is the difference between a professional designer and a professional UX person, somebody who's got some talent, but can only work when they feel like it. And when they're lost and have no ideas, they have nothing to draw on to do it by logic. Now, some of these things are really interesting. Now, some people have argued for me. This woman who's a historian of costumes tells me I'm wrong on this, but I'm not sure I'm wrong. So, regardless, let's pretend I'm right. Man or woman's shirt?
Woman.
It's a woman. How do you know? Really? Because they side the buttons are on. Now, is this just that women are different than men, or that they're wired differently, that they button, or is it arbitrary which side you button? How many men have ever worn a so-called unisex shirt that buttons the other way around? Has anybody had a shirt that buttons the wrong way around? And I use the word wrong advisedly. I have. I can't do it with buttons. It's really interesting. I can't do up the buttons. It's really hard. Women tend to wear men's clothing more often than men wear women's clothing. And therefore, you're more adept at buttoning up the right way around. Why is that? So as I have read and seen it in some places, so I can only say this with 80% confidence in full. When buttons came out, they were expensive. The only people who could afford buttons were rich people. Rich people at the time buttons evolved. The men dressed themselves, the women were dressed by their ladies in waiting. And therefore, the buttons were there for the convenience of the person who dressed and undressed them, not for the purpose of the wearer. With men, the person who dressed and undressed me was the same person as the wearer, but for women, that was not the case. So women's button up correctly for the people who put the clothing on and off. And actually, men have benefited from the legacy of that ever since. Now, see, that's in terms of dressing women. We're in the university. What I want to say about this is, this is really important. You can sort of say, I'm telling you a story, why is this relevant to what we're doing? This is fundamental to understanding how to do what is called bimanual asymmetric action, which is exactly what this is. There's a friend of, Bob knows him, I think Andy might, was then at EPR. He's a really neat guy. And one of my graduate students discovered him, and I read a paper of his, and the paper was so cool, I literally flew to France to go to a conference I had no interest in being at, because I searched him on the internet and found out that he was speaking there. And they just walked up to him, and apparently he tells me, I walked up and said, hi, my name's Bill Buxton. You don't know me, but I'm going to make you famous, because what you're doing is brilliant, and you don't even know about my field. And if you just come to SIG High, I'll teach you, you'll find out there's a whole bunch of people who want to know what you know about bimanual interaction. So Paul Kamash is the guy who did so. So here's his rules. In his paper, he described there's 4 basic rules about bimanual asymmetric action. So symmetric action is this and that, which we don't do very often, right? But when you have independent action, both hands are moving at the same time, there's some rules. And here's the rules. The non-dominant hand, I'm doing this from a right-handed perspective. Left-handed people are not mirror images of right-handed people because they live in they've been a little bit corrupted by living in a right-handed world, so they adapt better and they're wired slightly differently. But for right-handed people, the non-dominant hand moves first. So that's rule one. Second rule, the non-dominant hand establishes the location of where the activity will take place. You anchor the buttonhole. The dominant hand moves second, that's rule number 3, and the dominant hand does the fine motor action. And if you take threading the needle, almost any other sport, it actually, he analyzes tennis and golf using the same rules, so slight variations and so on. But there's a few exceptions. If strength is there, like stacking firewood, you'll do it the other way because your right dominant arm is stronger, so you'll break the rules. So it's a few exceptions, stuff like that. But for the most part, these things are well codified. Now what this says is that if somebody says, Ken Hinckley has this great way of saying, how many people are right-handed? And people put their hand. How many people left-handed? Put people their hand. He says, you're nuts. None of you are, you're all both-handed. Because you do almost nothing that's only one-handed. So why do you call yourself right-handed? The question, because we always write this way that the left hand is just a poorer version of the right hand. No, it's a highly specialized instrument, which neurologically, and this is natural, this is ingrained, is really different, wired, from what this hand's good at. They are complementary. What this is good at, this is bad at. What this is bad at, that's good at. And therefore, yes. Can you write with both hands? There are people who are ambidextrous, but if you can't write with both hands, then I've proven that this can do things really well that this is really bad at. And now I can show you other things that this hand can do that this hand is bad at. So the point is this. So I got half the argument anyhow. So out of 50% with that example, right?
I was trained as a left-handed person when I was right-handed.
That's right.
That happened to a lot of people, especially in Europe.
Especially in Asia also.
Yes.
And so that I take those people as exceptions, and I'm saying that they were interfered with. That wasn't the natural course of evolution, of their development. And your handwriting probably paid a price ever after.
Right?
And right, you notice I was predicting that because it was forced unnaturally, and you probably weren't a very good artist. Now, no, because it's, there's a literature, right? And so the point I'm just getting at is this: once you understand that, if I start saying let's use two hands, then you start seeing people doing stupid things with two hands. If you don't understand these principles, you can't understand there are things. I lied earlier when I said looping and pain and stuff like that. There are other things which are in fact innate, and you can reasonably count on in terms of behavior and what human capacity is. And once you understand these things at this kind of level, then you can start to design to use the non-dominant hand appropriately with the dominant hand. So when we have systems like, this is what I argue about all the time, and Ken Hinckley, Bob's done stuff around this and so on, myself, around this, when people say touch interfaces are really good, no, pen interfaces are really good, no, touch, touch, touch. It's like Republicans and Democrats just yelling at each other. When in fact, it's a stupid argument. Everything's best for something and worst for something else. The question is, the wise person knows which. And since I have two hands and they can agree to cooperate, why can't the technologies? And so the fact is, it's not a question of a pen interface or a touch interface. It's actually pen and touch simultaneously. And the stuff I do with my non-dominant hand are things that are well suited for touch. And the pen can come in and do the fine work, because that's what it's with the other hand. And working the two in concert is way better than everything touch, everything pen. Steve Jobs didn't, he knew that. I knew Steve. He was being a marketer, not a historian or a kinesiologist, when he said if you have a pen. It was too expensive, and he decided, so he made some cockamamie story to tell you if you see a pen, it was a failure of design, they blew it. He'd go to the whiteboard when I was in meetings with him, and he'd be writing on the thing, and among other things, to tell you why pens weren't useful. Think about that for a minute. So you have to separate the hype and that from the reality. But if you have it, and this is why, again, why you go to university for this stuff, and why it's worth serious study. And we're saying you'll never end learning. So we can go on like this. When we start to understand the human, which is the only technology worth serious study, everything else we can cavalier about. But then we can know which technologies to use when and how to bring them in. We can start thinking about when to use a gesture, what's an appropriate gesture, but it's not about the gesture. How do I combine the gesture with the other tools like a stylus, and maybe couple my voice with it, because now I can layer through different modalities, different channels of thought that to build this composite of the transaction I want to do. And this has been studied again if you go to classic human factors. There's a guy named Chris Wickens who has shown that he can exploit things like what's called the cocktail party effect, where if he gives you binaural hearing so that you don't need to have headphones on, the sound, you perceive the sound between your ears inside your head. Well, there's ways to produce audio so that when you put on headphones, the sound appears all around outside your head. And most people have never perceived that, except in the real world. But until the sound appears from outside your head in different directions, you can't focus on one sound or another. That's why if you ever took a microphone and you recorded a party where you can hear what people are saying, you can't make it out after when you play it back when it's mono, because everything's layered up, so you've lost the ability of spatial hearing. It's called the cocktail party effect. And you can divert your attention, and we also have this other capability called word spotting. So you can listen to 5 different radio stations at a time, and if somebody says key words on that one when I'm attending to this one, I will pick those up and I can change my focus of attention, but I need spatial hearing for that. Little things like that. All these things start to be things that we can start to exploit if we want to use them. But it also means on the input side, the same types of thing. I'll give you an example and as I wrap up to show you how I apply this. There's a video on my website that you can just look at if you want to see it. But you take a phone. I view these things in terms of economics. I want elegant design is economy of motion. Unless I'm doing dance where the gymnastics like that or movement is part of the art. But I want it smooth and economical. So here's the analysis about how I would analyze something like a phone here. So I'm sorry for a couple I speak today, but I've already used this example. People talk about these phones, whether it's an iPhone or a Windows phone, and so on. So these things are really amazing. That's really natural interaction because look, it's really natural to swipe. Use my finger to move the photos and to move my page up and down. It's really natural to pinch to zoom and so on and so forth. I'll say, well, okay, those are gestures, and that you do that. But then I apply a little bit of critical thinking. It's really neat compared to the crummy ways we did it before, but compared to how we function in the real world, and not through these crummy technologies, it's really terrible. If I use a lens in my camera, I can move around, I can pan, and I can zoom simultaneously. And furthermore, I can do it with one hand. And furthermore, I can do it without a touch screen. Everybody has a digital camera, does it all the time. I can do it with this phone. If I turn the camera on, and if I put a document down there, I could go into a map and go in detail and do it like that, like so. Everybody knows what I'm saying is true. Now, that's a 3-dimensional navigation task. It's 3 degrees of freedom, simultaneously articulated by one limb, my handheld device. Now, what do you have on your fancy smartphone? By the way, they're not smartphones, stop calling them that. They're half smartphones at best. They're only smart compared to the things that were there before. So call them smarter phones, but anybody who calls the thing smart has a very low set of standards. Now, on a small form factor, you can pinch, but while you're pinching, the form factor makes it too small to pan. So that's a 1 degree of freedom task, zoom in and out. I can pan up and down, left, right, so I have 2 degrees of freedom in the panning. So this way, I take 2 hands, a touch screen, and I have a 2 + 1 degree of freedom task, right? And sequentially. I can either be panning or zooming. So 2 + 1 does not equal 3 if we're talking about degrees of freedom. And I'm wasting 2 hands and a touch screen. Now, I can do the navigation task here. So now I've chunked together, using my vocabulary. I'm trying to apply what we've just learned. I can chunk together the zooming and panning to an integrated action. Okay, that's a chunk, right? So now I've got those things together, and I'm only using one hand. So now I can layer on top of that, while I'm moving around, to select things and mark and move on top, because the touchscreen is free for me to do that. But it's got a microphone on the phone, so while I'm doing it, I can be describing things too. So I can have a map. I want you to come to my house for dinner tonight. So I'm gonna get the map, I'll go to Bing Maps, I'll go there, I'm gonna navigate through, and while I'm navigating, I'm gonna be pointing, and I'm gonna be telling you where to turn here, but okay, when you go to the A&W, go past it one street, be very careful, don't turn to the first one, this is the second one, okay? Then keep going to the second stop sign, right here, and go there, right? I'm gonna send that to you. And I'm gonna CC your car. And so it's gonna go to your car, and all my voice instructions and my map are gonna be there, and so I'll read it out to you, because you shouldn't be listening to playing with your phone while you're driving to get to my house, because it's too far to walk. And if I left steps out, the woman inside will explain the rest, right? Now, I'll give you another example. We're skiing in Switzerland, or no, at Whistler. Okay. Very cool. There's a mountain, the hotel's right over there, just in the foreground. Take my camera, go there. Take a snapshot. Okay, now, if I have very low standards, I'll send Instagram. Okay? Okay, those guys make a lot of money. You want to make a gazillion dollars? Listen to me. Take the picture. When I've got the picture taken, then, and I might even go click, click, click and make a panorama. So now I've got this wide angle view here, just automatically from the camera. We all know how to do that. You can download it for free from Microsoft Research. And then I'm going to count, I'm going to move around the image, and I'm going to say, okay, this is where I ski, and we started up here, it was absolutely fantastic. You should have seen, I fell here, it took me half an hour to find my ski in the snow, in the powder, it was so deep. I got up and I finally came down. This is my hotel room right here, we had a great night, and it was only a short walk to this bar where we went after a half-day ski. I've marked it, I can point, I can mark, I can speak, I can direct you, and then I can email it to you. And the experience when you get it will be exactly like looking over my shoulder while I was there, but I'm in Whistler and you're here stuck at Brown. And nothing, when I talk about transfer skills, what I just described is interesting because every one of you know how to do what I just described. You know how to move around because you know how to work a camera, transfer skill. You know how to speak, you know how to point, and you know how to mark. And you could send that message, and there'd be no typing, and which would be more intimate, which would be more natural, which would be more personal to your mother, your sisters, your boyfriend, or girlfriend when they got that message. Compare that to Instagram. Compare that everything I described has been possible for the last 5 years on every single so-called smartphone available, and nobody's done it. And I'll take even further. I talked about Dr. Wang, the doctor. The last hurrah before they went out of business was they made something called Wang Freestyle. That was at the same time that before Windows 3.0 was released. And they shipped a product called Freestyle. If you go to my YouTube channel, WAS Buxton, my initials are Was, William Arthur Stewart, Buxton, you will find Wang Freestyle. And the point is this, they were shipping that back then, that capability to speak, point, mark on top of a static document and send that long ago, before many of you were born. They were doing that commercially, and we still can't do it today. And we pride ourselves on having smartphones and being ever so clever and natural interfaces. I just say that that's, again, we are so bad, things are moving so slowly, and we are so lazy, and it's like, you know, I just call it, yeah, it's just, we're a bunch of sheep. One person gets success, we say, well, that's the way everything has to go. We have to have independent thinking. We have to trust our judgment. And that's the only thing that's ever brought progress. But the way you have sound foundation, that having to use your own judgment, is what's it based on? Everything I described follows logically from the things I've been talking about today. You notice I layered a whole bunch of things using different modalities, like Wiccans, when I said put the radios in different things, I'm using different modalities for different channels of different parts of the message. I can layer them all, I can do them all at once, and there's hardly any interface. And I completely change the nature of the experience. And that's one example. I argue, if you apply the stuff we're talking about, you can in fact start to make things natural in a meaningful sense. That starts coming into your natural emotions, the natural satisfaction, the natural phrasing, the natural sense of accomplishment. And then we can start to really be worthy of our education and worthy of the opportunity, I think is more than our potential. And the only thing that I tried to do today is say, there's a transition that we're going through that I would articulate it this way. This is how I'll leave it. Andy and I have been in this business for a long time. He's been much longer than me because I'm a kid. But I'm just joking in a way, but he was one of the people who really influenced me when I was your age. I first used a computer in 1971, and I would argue that from then until about 5 years ago, the fundamental thing, the challenge was, can we make this thing work? And there was this sense of, in many cases, a sense of amazement, a worry, but like, my God, it actually works. We can sell it, and people will actually buy it. And then amazement that we actually did. The first time I ever was in Windsor Park, the first probably transcontinental voice over IP conversation we did between Park and RPI. So the point is this, those days are gone. And the question is no longer, can we do it? Can we make it work? I would argue, if you take the makers movement, all these things that are happening right now, and the standards and the bar that's been set by things like the iPhone. The question for your generation is not, can we do it? The answer to that is absolutely yes. So now that you can do anything, the question becomes, what should you do? How should you do it? And who should you do it for? And why? And that brings a completely different set of responsibilities, a completely different mindset, and a completely different set of standards for how you approach it. And by the way, I'd argue it takes a completely different team. Because the things you make, more than ever, aren't technologies, they're actually cultural artifacts that are going to shape society and shape the culture. And the key thing about that is, how do you keep a human-centric perspective to that? To keep it natural, that reflects the values, reflects the culture, because that's one of the skills I mentioned, the cultural skills. And I've touched on some psychology, I've touched on some other things here, the human factors, and a little bit of the social parts, a little bit about how we learn. But the point is, on all of these aspects, that takes the full breadth of the impact of the technologies we introduce into our society. There are rules, things like that, where we can in fact shape these things in a way where it's more likely to be good than bad. To be very clear, last thing I'm going to say. One of my heroes is a guy named Melvin Kranzberg. Very few people have heard of him. He's a historian of technology. He has a couple laws. His first law is technology is not good, it's not bad, but nor is it neutral. It will be some combination of good and bad. Buxton's corollary to that is, without informed design, it's more likely to be bad than good. Once you've heard Kranzberg's first law in Buxton's corollary, it says that therefore we have an obligation, once you understand that and acknowledge it, to make best efforts to get it good rather than bad. That's why I talk about this stuff. And the final thing is, you will never get it all right. So his second law is, invention is the mother of necessity. That once you invent something and you put it out there, you are going to have a need to fix it. Because it will be used in ways that you didn't anticipate. You're going to fix the stuff you got wrong, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But it's a whole new imperative. And let's tell you, if I had a choice of being in our generation about the technology in yours, I'd rather be in yours than mine any day. We had some low-hanging fruit, but you get to do the stuff that makes a difference. Knowing this will get better at it. You're more likely to come out the right side of the cancer's first law. And now I'll stop. Thank you.
We know it's late. We know you have other obligations and appointments, but Bill loves the paid schmooze.
He's happy to talk
Come up and talk to him if you like. I'll be taking him to get him.
Thanks very much. And my YouTube channel is WAS Buxton, and so is my Twitter. So for what it's worth, if you want to reach me.
I know really interesting that this conversation is happening here in the design department. So, how did it turn out that way? Why is it still so much, why is there not so much good conversation? So that way design it.
So